Hello, everyone. I hope everyone can hear me. Welcome to this AIRstream Exchange. We have the esteemed Laura Mayer here. She is the executive producer of new show development at Midroll, and she's going to talk to you all about the art of the podcast deal. We're so excited to have her. Her wealth of knowledge and expertise is massive. She's been in podcasting for about 10 years, and I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to have her take it away. I'll introduce her quickly, but then also just a quick note that if you want to ask a question, you can either type something in that say something nice box in the corner, or you can click the ask a question button at the bottom, and then we'll aggregate the questions for Laura. But let me just share my screen quickly and we will start going. Share screen. Okay, cool. All right, can everyone see the slides? Laura, can you see it?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. So thank you again for coming, and we hope this will be a fruitful session. We'll take about an hour, but if less, then we'll have more time for your questions. So Laura is the executive producer of new show development at Midroll Media, and as I mentioned, she's been in podcasting for almost a decade, and she was the first employee at the podcasting network Panoply, and she was the one who was responsible for launching the first season of Revisionist History, Bad with Money with Gaby Dunn, personal favorite, I love her, and dozens of shows. So we're going to sort of walk you through the process of pitching a show to a network all the way through getting the green light, and then questions about intellectual property, questions about how to pitch and what sort of are the structures in place that make your pitch successful. And we're going to sort of walk you through that stage of start to finish. So let's start with generally, Laura, what would you say is the layout of the podcast network landscape? We can talk US, internationally, whatever your expertise is, but we would love to know sort of how many networks are there, who are the big hitters, and how many people can you sort of imagine are in this space?
Sure. Well, thank you for having me be part of this. I was just sort of nodding and looking glassily at my webcam before this started, but I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you all. So my expertise is in the US podcast networks and production houses, just because I am here. But I can go through, just the general landscape here and the kind of the vague, potentially incorrect, but very Googleable information that I have about Canada and then the broader world outside of the US. So basically, I should start with a disclaimer, which is that every podcast network is sort of like a living, breathing institution that has its own internal expectations and business needs and missions and all that kind of stuff. And so despite the fact that a lot of the podcast networks may seem to act similarly, like the podcasts end up in iTunes with ads in it, a lot of the times when you are interacting with a podcast network, either to, start a pitch or to work with them, you may come across some special internal interests that they may have, or content focuses for the year. And so in general, I always advise people, and I have a lot of these conversations myself, just as I'm in the role of, taking in pitches and developing ideas and that kind of thing, is to kind of have a, casual, candid conversation as much as you can with anybody that at any of the networks or production houses, which I'll get to kind of just get a sense of the specific rules of the game at the production houses. So I've talked a lot about that vaguely. I'll get into the specific ones. And so to me, and I think that I've seen this be kind of conflated a little bit, and it's confusing. It was confusing for me for a while, but I see that there's a distinction between podcast networks and podcast production houses. And I think that from a listener or even a producer standpoint, especially an independent producer standpoint, they can all kind of seem the same, but they're very different in operation. So the main thing is networks tend to do a combination of the following things. So they'll do production often, but they'll also do ad sales, they'll do marketing, they'll do distribution, and they'll do audience development. And those are for shows that they create in-house, and also ones that they acquire from outside and then sell ads for them. And so there's a lot of different kind of moving parts within a network Some networks do all of these things. Some networks only do a handful of them, but generally that seems to be what the definition of a network is, that there's many different these different activities that they do as part of their day-to-day business. And some US examples of that are Midroll, Panoply, Gimlet, Wondery, which is in LA. The other ones I just mentioned are in New York. American Public Media, Audible, Feral Audio, which is on the West Coast. Wondery is also on the West Coast, and then Loudspeakers Network. And so when you are going to go pitch a network, generally there are a bunch of different conversations that you can have, and I'm happy to get into that later on in the presentation or in your questions. But it's usually becomes a conversation with someone at a network when you're pitching an idea, a two-way conversation about where do you see your story, if you're pitching a story or a series, fitting, and what they can what paths they can provide for your series. And so that's just sort of the top line stuff about networks. Production houses tend to, as the name suggests, focus on production specifically. So they're really about the making. And that doesn't mean that production houses don't do some of those other things I was mentioning, like ad sales, distribution, marketing, all that good stuff. But generally, production is really their top line, day-to-day doing business kind of goal. And the way that production houses tend to make their money, whereas networks usually do it based on some combination of ad sales, apps, or content management systems. Production houses tend to look for stories, and then they will sell them to networks with a pretty substantial production margin, and that's how they end up making their money. And so just because I've only been on the network level, I've seen people, I've only seen pitches that have come in from either individuals or production houses to the networks looking for usually financial support or ad sales distribution, that kind of thing. But I think that there is a world in which a independent producer who maybe is alone or a small team has an idea that they think could do really well. In that case, you would go to a production house, which in all likelihood, assuming there wasn't some other kind of special dealing, like, a brand that's looking to sponsor a podcast on X topic, but the production house would then go to a network. And that, again, it's funny, just in the past, I've been joking that over the past 4 years, I've been working in big podcast for as long as someone could be working in big podcast. And I've seen things change so much. And so, I would really, for those of you who are watching, consider what I'm saying, the state of affairs right now. This may change in 6 months, in 3 months, in a year, but that's generally the way that I've seen it go.
That's fascinating. So in terms of your 10 years of experience, has it been sort of like a ballooning of, opportunities over the past 10 years? And you say it's changing really fast. Would you say there's any condensing happening, or is it really just like the opportunities are multiplying?
Sure. Well, so podcasting was a lot different, and the way that I worked in podcasting was a lot different 10 years ago. I started as a producer at WNYC, and I was also just in my spare time working on a number of podcasts, the main one being Benjamin Walker's. It's called Too Much Information then. So that was before it became, again, The Theory of Everything. And that was me just trying to figure out a home for my weird stories, many of which I've not listened to since they aired because I am ashamed of that period of my life. But it was a lot of fun, and it gave me the creative freedom that I didn't necessarily, that wasn't my job at WNYC. And then, so that was kind of my experience as a producer, and it was fun, and it was kind of everything that you sort of hear I think the broader media's take on podcasting, which is just it was the wild west of you could do whatever you want, no broadcast clocks and all that. Okay, I'm seeing someone saying that the stream has stopped.
Oh, okay. Let me check. Let's just stop sharing my screen for a sec.
Maybe it's an internet problem.
Okay here. All right. Yeah, let's go back then. Yeah, it looks like it was just lagging.
Okay.
Present.
Cool.
There you go. Okay.
And so then when I ended up I was at WNYC. I worked at the show, a number of shows, but I ended it on the media. And that was during the period of time where there was like this big exodus, and it's still happening from WNYC when Gimlet started. And then Panoply began, and I ended up being hired. Just really, I was interested in the dental plan that was open to me. But it ended up being a great experience. And during that period of time, which I guess would have been 2014, 2015, with these networks starting, I think that that's where I personally got more involved in kind of understanding the various reasons why, companies acquire shows, make shows on their own, how it's done, got really into, and I'm very interested in just like ad sales and how that changes. But I'd say that that's really when there became this sort of wave of, sorry, I'm hearing an echo. I am not just talking really slow. But that's when it became this sort of wave of like, oh, this is a larger industry, and there's a way to make some, significant money for creators and then for networks for getting larger things off the ground. And of course, Serial happened like, I think 8 months before a lot of these networks launched. And as we all know, that had something to do with where we are today.
Yeah, that's a good segue actually to the next question, which is the approach. And all of the folks that you've been talking about probably went through this at some point. How do I get my foot in the door of a network?
So as I was thinking about this, I guess I think that I see, like, just for me, and I'm sure there are other ways, like two different kind of definitions of that. Like foot in the door, meaning like if you want to work at a podcast network, or foot in the door if you want to pitch a podcast series to a podcast network. And I can talk about both, but I'm wondering what would be more helpful.
I think probably the latter. A lot of our folks are indies, and so they're sort of figuring out how they can find a home for their show.
Okay, cool. And so I guess that the main, again, I'm going to use this disclaimer again, which is that every network is completely different. And then they will have different, internal content plans for that year. And so a pitch can be received totally differently depending on what network you're sending it to. And that has to do with a combination of like how they are thinking about their programming and what they see their company is doing. And so just couch all of this blathering in that. And this is just from my observations too. I've only worked at two different podcast networks, but podcast networks work together. And just by virtue of the fact that I'm in New York, all my friends are audio producers. So I hope for all of our sakes that nothing happens to this industry. But so this is just, what I've seen. And so I think that with pitching a podcast series, you all are seasoned journalists and producers, all of the same rules for like pitching a feature or a story apply. Like, what are the characters, the who, what, when, where, why, all of that kind of stuff. Like a good story needs to exist. And I'm talking specifically about, and I can talk about a different kind too, but specifically about like a reported kind of multi-part series with high production value, sound design, all that kind of stuff. Like stuff that really podcast idea that could go to series and really be an example of craft, for example. But I think that in addition to just all of the normal, kind of boxes you have to check in order to have a story that has legs, you also have to think about how the podcast would like live and breathe and exist and make money for all parties within the podcast like space itself. And so I just, as in my current role at Midroll, and I was about to say want to be public podcast intellectual, and I think this webinar is really helping me out here. So thanks, guys. There are a couple of like sort of boilerplate questions that I ask myself, I ask my team, I ask producers when I talk to them. And I'm just going to read out some of the most important ones here. And the top one I always find helpful and felt like a revelation to me, but probably not to others, which is like when you are putting the series out there, when you're pitching and standing behind it, I think it's really important that you are able to answer and believe the answer to the question of why does this series need to happen now? And that doesn't necessarily mean there needs to be a news peg, but there does need to be, and I've seen this just from the network side of things in the positive response to producers thinking in this way, but there needs to be a really clear understanding and kind of respect for the audience that it will be reaching. And in a lot of cases, at least from what I've seen over the past couple of years, so much of a network's decision-making process of what they're going to put a bunch of resources, money, personnel behind is being able to come to put ideas out there that will launch really well and will kind of make that initial splash. Because just for the state of the industry right now, as you all know, like discovery is hard. A lot of the kind of shows that have become phenomenons have, been these sort of like creative risks that haven't existed before. And that has gotten them attention from, the media, and that's, and people will talk about them on other podcasts and to their friends. But I do think that for a network to really put the resources behind something, they need to kind of have a sense that this is going to be something that will attract listeners that exist right now. And that means, or at least what that means for me, is often when someone's pitching something to me, I'll ask, like, who do you think of as the audience? And there's that whole thing about, like, who is that person sitting there listening to it? But to go beyond that, also, where do those people exist right now in hopefully large numbers, loyal numbers in podcasts right now? Like, where are those listeners? And I think that comparable podcasts is really helpful for that. Being able to kind of think of what your series would be and what is like it, but not it out there. And this isn't a way to encourage just like, kind of schlocky ripping off of ideas have already been done, because that's how I initially took when someone would ask me for comparables. This is just a way to translate to the creative team that you'd be talking with, but also later on to the business, marketing, ad sales side that will eventually be part of the whole greenlight process, what this show really will be. And being able to point to like concrete terms or concrete examples of something that already exists, that can really help make that a reality.
So would you classify that almost as like market research?
I think so. And I think that, you all are listeners too. And I think that it's not, at least in my mind, just based on the listening that I do, and I know my friends do, it's sort of like being able to point out the likenesses. It doesn't mean having to like kind of reach back and do some kind of statistical analysis, though I would love to have the opportunity to waste like 3 months and do that myself. But that lawyer wouldn't like that.
Totally. And we have a question from Hillary, who asks, when there isn't a news bent on a podcast, what is an example of why we would need this podcast now?
Okay. So a good example, and I'm eliminating true crime from all of my discussions here, because that is a special sterling at this moment genre that kind of defies all of these rules. And what I'm about to say does have a news bent to it, but I think it's kind of hard to escape the news over the last year. But I think that like the explosion of crooked media is a really good example of this. Yes, Pod Save America, like they discuss news of the day twice a week with 3 people who had ties to the Obama administration. Like it makes all of the sense in the world. But I think that the reason why they've been able to gain such popularity, and not just like anecdotally, but also if you take a look at like the top podcasts loaded on any given day, it's generally like 2 or 3 at least of the crooked media podcasts, which to me kind of helps me understand where the loyalty and the immediacy is. But like even like Love It or Leave It, for example, or Crooked Conversations, which is not news related. That's sort of their attempt to do, talk about topics with people who are in the news maybe, but aren't like in the exact news cycle, which Pod Save America kind of rides. Like they're trying to do this kind of brilliant thing, which is be able to take what they've been able to capture that has been able to exist just as a result of the crazy like effing year we've had, and then have the audience there to be able to move them to things that are kind of more general and podcasty, honestly. Let me think of another example.
I'm also curious because a lot of our independent producers are really dedicated to sort of the craft of audio storytelling and highly produced stories. That's a great question for our network, who, you know, are curious about telling stories that might not necessarily be about news, but definitely have that high production value aspect.
If the stream stops, it's because I've opened my iTunes. I'm just taking a quick look at what's up on the charts. Man, so many things about people getting murdered. My God. Let me think. Well, and I'm like, there were a lot of reasons I think why this show ended up doing well, but I'm just thinking in terms of like the development conversations that came out before Revisionist History, the first season of Revisionist History came out. I mean, like Malcolm Gladwell's a famous guy, and he like loves Twitter like that. Yes, you know, like people were going to listen to that. But I think that in those specific conversations, just about like, why do we want to do a show that's essentially cultural commentary now? That era of time, of course, it was like a year and a half ago, like looking back before the election, there were just so many, it was like peak think piece, if that was possible. And Malcolm was someone who, you know, he's the guy who like invented the, well, turns out kind of thing. And it just felt like that there was already something in the air, not necessarily in podcasting, but in media in general, that people would be able to hook onto. And that ended up being the right bet. With Gaby Dunn, as an example, like that came up because, you know, we really liked Gaby. And had been following her for a long time, but also, you know, personally, and then within the news, there had been so much talk specifically about student debt. And so we thought, and I made this case as, you know, basically a producer, you know, to my boss when I was at Panoply, that, you know, this show has an audience of people who are interested in this topic. It's kind of a generational thing. Here are XYZ examples. Like I made a document that said that. And then furthermore, I kind of did the more tactical, like Gaby has this many YouTube followers, this many Twitter followers, and this engagement. So I guess maybe that all of these are sort of things that are in the air, but not necessarily hard, like news pegs. Did I answer the question?
Yeah, I think so. Okay. We have two more questions on this this angle, but then I want to move on to budgets and intellectual property. So I'll ask the two from Willow and Elaine. So Willow asks, what if you're pitching a show that already exists? How does that change your strategy, and does that even work? And then we'll follow up with Elaine's question about what about pitching interview shows?
So pitching a show that already exists, and I'm assuming that you were a producer of this show, like you have been with it from the beginning, that does work. The issue is a lot of that conversation generally, like there will be a creative conversation, at least in my experience, with people who are looking to, you know, bring over shows that already exist, but very quickly the business side of things will get involved to kind of really drill down on download numbers, because the most traditional path for that is, you know, you have a show, you want like more production resources for it, or you want a home for it, or you want regular advertising opportunities for it. The network is going to ask that is going to want to know all these questions, because they're going to want to know if they're going to be able to sell it reliably or easily, or to a specific sponsor that they might potentially have on deck and you like really emailed on at a good time, or if it's something where, you know, there's some flexibility in terms of, you know, you as a creator are interested in redoing the show in some kind of way, or you want to kind of have a larger conversation about how the show could, you know, still exist but take on a different form. That is the other way to do it. But again, there will need to be some, you know, a case made and some calculations done from within, a case made by you and calculations done from within the industry of like how this, or within the network of how this fits into the specific company's plan, their ad sales strategies, and all that kind of stuff. And that's sort of luck of the draw. It's like if you email on a good day, basically. Cool. I know that's not helpful, but it's what I've seen.
Yeah, and then quickly, if you want to touch on just interview shows, do you think there's a market for that?
I think there is. I think that there's some fatigue generally. Like I just, from my personal listening, like I call it my joy listening, stuff that I listen to that I have nothing to do with, I listen to in my free time. It's generally interview shows because I grew up listening to like NPR and then also a healthy dose of talk radio. I do think that the issue is the ex-celebrity interviews ex-celebrity friends thing is like very, very done. There are some shows that obviously do really well, like Mark Maron for years and all that good stuff. But, I think that there is, if it's an idea that's able to kind of push the medium forward in some kind of way, that's going to be a lot more enticing. I think I've seen more of like politically adjacent person talks to why politically insidery person, like the Preet Bharara podcast, which I love. And I think that that's a good example of, they kind of saw an opportunity of like access. And because what you're really getting when you're listening to a good interview show generally, and there are all kinds of exceptions to everything I'm saying here, but what you're getting as a listener is getting the sense of being able to, hang out with a host, like develop that sort of like companionship. And at least for me, like this kind of like, what would it like to be friends with X person kind of vibe on a weekly basis? And you're getting an opportunity to be able to hear their point of view and get introduced to their world in a specific way. And I think that when those two qualifications go together, that a great talk show it makes. But I do think that there is definitely some creative opportunities for figuring out how to push it beyond, just famous people talking to famous people, or, political person talking to insideries, like figuring out what is an audience, what are you interested in, and what is the audience there where you would want to do a different spin to it. And then also, sorry, I'm talking a lot on this, but I do think that if someone were to kind of come up with an idea that was a fresh take on that, and were able to prove that people would listen to it, I think that from a production standpoint, just from like a Craven network level, generally the talk show format is something where you can do more episodes in a year, especially if it's something that's not completely newsy. You can bank them, and the more episodes in a year, and generally the length of like over 20 minutes or so, means that an ad sales team can look at that podcast and be like, oh, that's something that we can like build an audience for over the course of the year, which is harder to do generally with shorter run series. And the production tends to be cheaper because it's usually, fee for guest, fee for producer, fee for engineer, that sort of thing.
Awesome. I think that's actually a good segue into, okay, well, we have intellectual property first, and then we'll definitely talk about budgets. And we have some questions here about samples of shows and download numbers, but we'll get to that towards the end. So when it comes to intellectual property, I know this is on a lot of people's minds. How do you make your pitch strong? And then a sort of a follow-up question, how do you make sure you don't lose out on your idea? We've heard from people who said that they've pitched a show to a network, and then the network has decided to take it in-house, and so that person has sort of lost out on their own idea.
That like sends shivers. I don't have the constitution personally to ever do something like that. I have never heard something like that happening, but I believe it, and that sucks, and that's something that should never happen. I think in terms of the intellectual property, and Kate and I talked about this briefly earlier in the week, the issue about retaining your intellectual property doesn't necessarily have to do with the strength of your pitch. I think that intellectual property in a lot of cases, like if it's reporting that you've done or a very specific idea, like it has to do with specificity and things that you've filled out on your own, and that make the show a show. Like it's the difference between, just because talk shows are fresh in my mind, like someone going to a podcast network and being like, hey, I think we should do a talk show that is about feminist issues. where that's sort of like, that's kind of broad. And it is totally possible that, you know, a network could decide that they had been thinking about turning their resources towards that anyway, and they just decide to go do it. But if you were to say, I think we should do a show hosted by, and I'm just using like a bunch of random nouns that are in my head right now, but like Rose McGowan with X person about trying to do something like X in the feminist space. That is something that would be, you know, assuming that you've got talent on board, or at least you have that, or not even if you have talent on board, if you've like really clearly fleshed out how this podcast would exist, you will be the creator behind that IP. You will have the creative vision, and it, in my mind, would be a benefit to the network that you're pitching, that they would want you behind that. And so I think that just being able to make your pitch strong is just about being able to come to the table really believing and being well researched in what you're pitching. But also, and I think we'll get to this a little later, you know, if you're looking for some kind of production collaboration, also being clear that you're open to that sort of collaboration once a deal is done.
Right, definitely. Great. Let's talk about the NDAs and other legal matters of the thing. So you have your show idea, and maybe you have some audio attached that you've played for people, and you have your idea sort of fleshed out, and maybe you've had your, you know, your team listed, etc. How do you go into the legality at this stage where you've already shown your idea and you want to make sure that, you know, you've signed the correct paperwork, etc., and protected copyright?
So I'm not a lawyer. I have gone to legal Zoom in the past for my personal issues, and I've worked with lawyers within places that I've worked. But so I can give like top line, but I don't trust anything I say on this matter as legally binding.
Yeah, and I will underline that yes, always seek out the advice of a lawyer.
Yes, find a lawyer.
And Eric can help you out with suggesting resources if need be.
Yeah. But so an NDA is a non-disclosure agreement, and in practice, when either I've given them to producers to sign, where I'm trying not to let like the cat out of the bag about a specific project. Usually it has to do with someone who's like kind of a known name that we're trying to keep under wraps. Or when I've been asked to sign them, when someone has been pitching us, basically what that means is nothing that will be discussed in the room. And like if you were to give an NDA to a company, ideally that NDA would kind of cover the whole company as a whole, so that like all of this kind of like privacy and non-disclosure applies to anyone who's in the building or working remotely or anything like that. But it basically says that over the course of your conversations about X topic, X pitch, you've entered into a binding agreement that neither party not neither party, because if it's your idea, you're free to shop it around, whatever, but that the network or the person that you're pitching it to won't basically do anything actionable with that information until you've agreed to some sort of like business terms and both sides want to go forward. So that would stop, like say you're doing a podcast with, I don't know, Oprah, my favorite. And say you are best friends with Oprah, and Oprah has said to you, I want to do a podcast. And you're like, great. And you take it to Midroll, and Midroll sits down with you, and they're like, and you say Oprah wants to do a podcast. That would stop Midroll, which would never happen, by the way, let the record state, from going like, cool, having the meeting saying cool, and then being like, we should just call Oprah. And so that's the way that I think about it. The Oprah version of it is how it was explained to me.
Awesome. Cool. So have you seen independent producers come to you with an NDA that has then like been sort of the green light or the way that they've been able to shop their idea effectively?
I have seen it. I think that it's really helpful if you have an idea that either you've done a lot of, it protects you. And to be completely honest, and I think that this shouldn't be used as like a tactic, but whenever someone is like, hey, can you send an NDA before we talk? I'm like, ooh, I'm interested. Like that is something that's appealing, but that's not to encourage just, getting someone to sign an NDA before you have like a casual conversation.
Right. Yeah. So what I'm getting from everything you've been talking about with this and intellectual property is that like it's better to be careful and to protect your idea by number one, protecting your legal bases, and two, having your pitch as fleshed out as possible.
Right. And then ideally, and again, maybe this is just a Pollyanna-ish view of the industry, because I've never been privy to something like terrible like this happening. But I think that it always does, like this is still a relatively small industry. Like there is like 1 degree of Kevin Bacon. Like if another way that I've seen that I can imagine that would protect creators is if you're able to get a sort of connection, either if you know someone who works there or you know someone who knows the person you'd be pitching, like getting that connector email. Because again, I've never seen something like this happen, but I can certainly imagine that, getting email from me, again, I wouldn't do this, but getting an email from person I used to work with saying, hey, so-and-so has this great pitch, that would further remind me that, oh, everybody knows each other and I don't want to screw over my friend. And also, so that from like a production standpoint, I mean, and certainly this is kind of like pretty standard, but from a, just getting a response to your email standpoint, that also helps.
Right. And I would also just, don't mean to sort of plug AIR in this capacity, but I think the AIR network is really great at creating those relationships. So if you do feel like you're an outsider and you're not sure where to go, like post it on the AIR Daily, figure out who could be your ally, talk about the idea, and see if that's a way to sort of make connections. You don't have to be, at the top of the totem pole to get your idea made. It's all about just sort of like making that happen in terms of your community.
And just just a quick side note on that, I have seen, because in podcasting, and this is just maybe like my personal like crazy bugaboo because it's my only hobby and my job, but I think that there's a lot of sameness that's kind of crept in. And I think that might have to do with the fact that everyone is working with the same handful of people over and over again. And there's great stuff, but I have seen, and I have thought of this myself personally, like someone is going to figure out a format or a type of show that truly hasn't been done before, that is selfishly going to be very exciting for me as a listener to listen to when I'm not at work. And I think that those ideas are really more likely to come from people who are more like outsiders than people who have been sort of like swimming around in the same ponds for a lot of years, like me.
Awesome. Well, that is really great to hear as we talk about teamwork. Would you suggest bringing your team or just yourself? We've had questions from people who have asked, okay, like sometime I pitched a show, but it was only myself, and the network came back and said, we would love to have you sort of have a ready-made team that you could just come on board all together to show that you could create and produce this thing yourself. Other people have said the contrary, where they wanted to take the producer with the idea and then match them up internally with the team of people that they already have at their disposal at the network. So it can be both, but in your experience, what would you suggest?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the conflicting information that's happening here totally just has to do with what I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, which is like where podcasting is at that moment and what the respective networks like current production strategy is. And so, of like either trying to like farm things out completely or taking things in-house, like it will change. But what I have seen recently is that more and more, I think that it's helpful to have, if you have a team, that all of like the correct like creative team hygiene has been taking place with it. Like it's clear what the roles are, who is kind of going to be leading the pitch, what, that the schedules would be available to make something happen. Like coming to a pitch with a sort of group that is all on the same page, really wants to make it, and is doing like specifically different skills. That is something that for me, if I was receiving that pitch, I would be like, yes, I'm very into that, because it gives me a sense of, that the creator has really thought about how the show can actually exist, how it could be made. And of course, if they're able to, express that they're open to flexibility, like if there is someone on staff at the network who could really add something to it, like they would be cool with amending the team in that kind of way. I feel like that's the most, strong, but still sort of creatively flexible position that you can take when you're pitching.
I like that flexibility, definitely. And I'll bring Meg's question into the fold here. Is pitching the podcast idea enough, or do people also want to hear a sample of the show? This could go along with, bringing your team, like how polished is it? Are audio samples a nice to have? Are they necessary? What's the sort of threshold for that?
I think of sort of the audio sample as being very important, especially if it's something that, like isn't like either I'm not sure about, I haven't heard the work that someone has done that they're pitching me, or I'm not exactly sure how something would sound. Having some audio is helpful, or at least some audio of like if there's one character that's going to be through the series, that's super helpful. But I think of them less as like, yes, bring me full pilot, I will listen when I can, as like, you have something that demonstrates a proof of concept. And that can be like and like, maybe this is just me being kind of a shallow listener, but like I will take a like not super produced, like not mastered, like sizzle reel of like 3 interesting voices that you will be talking about in the pitch that I can listen to quickly, like within 3 or 4 minutes before the pitch, over like, here is this 25-minute, like fully done pilot to listen to before the pitch. Because the problem with that, and of course I try to keep an open mind, but I do think that in general, sending that kind of intense, like really fully fleshed out prep material ahead of a pitch can signal, if you're not really careful, like this is the way it has to sound and this is the length it has to be. And then also just from like a tactical standpoint, if you're sending it to someone and they don't have time to listen, there can be this sort of like weird thing in the pitch meeting where, of course, you're hoping that like, and assuming that I took the time to make this and I sent it to them and they should have had time to listen to it. And then you'll get someone who maybe is going through like 15 pitch meetings in 2 days and they haven't listened to it. And they'll be like, well, wait a second, what do you expect me to listen to it? Like, that's like totally a ridiculous thing. I have never done, but I've seen it happen. And so I think that just in terms of being able to make the best case for yourself, the proof of concept, and being able to, like, if you have a lot of faith that one particular character or group of characters or a specific like type of story that you're looking to dig into will sustain a full podcast series, include a 1.5 minutes of what those people sound like to make it real.
Awesome. I love that. Let's go on to budgets. Mm-hmm. Again, I hear you echoing flexibility, but in terms of budgets, is there any? How much needs to be mapped out when you do pitch?
So what I would do is avoid, like, I think that, and I've done this before, like in thinking about like, oh, I bet this show, like I've done this before as someone who's been like trying to get something made as a producer, and then also like recently from the other end being like, oh, this show will probably cost like $200,000, be like 10 episodes, like it'll probably just be that, and then not filling in the specifics. And from the producer standpoint, like as a pitch, like people will ask you those specifics. And then from a network standpoint, it's also like, you need to understand from the creator what exactly they see getting from that amount of money. And so what I would do is, and I wrote this down, like I have my most intense budget template, and then I have like different versions of it, and then I have like the chat show with one producer template, and that's 2 people. Okay. So this is an example of like the things that I will consider when I'm putting together a budget for like a super highly produced show with reporting, sound design, multiple people, all of that. And I can read those if that's helpful.
Sure, or if you're willing to share them afterwards, I can post it on the Air Daily, but I understand if that's not possible.
I'll just read it quickly. So okay. A budget line for the host, a reporter, an expert consultant, an editor, an executive producer, whether that comes from your side or the network side, a senior producer. This is like also the most intense one I have. Senior producer, assistant producer, archival and footage researcher, a composer, a mix master engineer, travel, licensed material, studio time for tracking, and voice actors, and tape sync fees, and the transcription. And so just in working from that, what I would do, or just thinking of like all of the things that I would start by being like, in an ideal world, what does this show need, and how many people doing these specific things does this need to exist in order for that to happen? And I would write all that out, and then I would do research on like just general payment stuff. And some of those questions are going to be hard to answer until you get a better sense of the shape of the series. And then I would go through, keep that like dream list. But then I would also go through and be like, well, like if we could combine some of these roles and, you know, do it in different ways, or if there was an opportunity to collaborate with the network who already has someone on staff so it wouldn't be on that budget line, like what's like the kind of more maybe doable from a budget perspective version of that. And then I would kind of make my non-negotiable, like these people have to be involved with this, have to be compensated in certain way in order to make this happen, sort of like your skeleton dream team. And then that helps you come in where you're not necessarily going to share all that stuff ahead of time, but you will have a better sense going into the pitch conversation, and then as you're figuring out next steps afterwards of, do you want to work with these people? Do you think that they'll be able to satisfy like the dreams that you have for this series? And then they will eventually ask you for all of those budget lines or some sense of it.
Mm-hmm. Cool. And on that note, quickly, if we could just talk about your own pay or salary, should you even put a line item in that says what you expect to pay for yourself?
Yes, always do that. Always do that. And I mean, and that, like, I feel like so many, like I send and receive so many emails and read them on listservs about like, how much should I make for X? Like that is still a frustratingly vague thing. But, you know, like, and this is a cliche at this point, but it's a very important cliche, which is like, know your worth. I would definitely think in terms of like, and I'm thinking of a reported like limited run series here, like imagine realistically, how much time will that take of you? Meaning like how many months, how many hours a week? And then I would break that down, like depending on what you see your role as being. So like if you are the executive producer, host, reporter, like if you're everything, like a lion's share of whatever the budget you've determined is probably going to go to you. But I think that it's so important to put those guidelines in, because what will often happen just when you're going kind of through a negotiation is they'll be like cutting down of the salary, and you want to make sure that your work is being recognized and is in the line item, even if the ultimate like, you know, the ultimate like result of the negotiation is you're given like a pot of money to do what you want with. But I think it's really important just from also coming in from yourself as like a creator. And I think of this like just for myself when I'm, you know, ever negotiating jobs for myself or whatever, you want to come in kind of making sure that they understand your worth as well. And I think that that's a good exercise, even if you're not, you know, getting it broken down ultimately by the deal, and being able to demonstrate the value that you add to the project.
Great. So this is our last question on the process, and then we have a few more from folks who are listening. But when you're getting closer to the green light, I've got some questions about what's the best way to follow up once you've pitched, and then sort of what's next in the process, and then we can talk about the remaining questions that people have.
Sure. Well, so the next steps and the follow-ups really kind of depends on where you left the meeting. What I would do is, like if it was a situation where your packet of materials was like an audio sample was sent to someone and then someone else was looped in and they saw a budget and blah, blah, blah. What I would do is after the meeting kind of combine all of these things together and kind of send a little bit of a story Bible is what I would think of it. That's what they call it with film stuff, to the entire group after the fact. And just so that they have everything in one place, including the audio, including everything. And so that they're able to be like, okay, sitting down in the various meetings to discuss things. Here is the short sizzle reel. Here is the budget expectations. Here's a bio of the main creator. And then if you've talked like timeline, for example, if you were talking to other networks, I would reiterate it in that email, just to kind of put the fire under the network folks to make a decision. I know that always helps for me. And then I would follow up in like 2 weeks, and then maybe again a week later to the specific person that you were talking to, probably on the creative end.
Awesome. Yeah, compiling everything. That's really good advice. So there's not a lot of loose ends.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Okay, yeah, so this is our last topic area, and we do have a question from John that ties nicely into this. So should I keep doing my own thing? And then possibly, Laura, I know you're not the expert on this, but possible funding avenues or advertising if you want to stay independent. And then tied into that, John asks, what kind of CV are you looking for from your indie collaborators? Are you looking for long resumes and successful last projects, or is this not very important? So this there's two edges of this coin. It's like, okay, I'm an indie that what sort of resume should I have if I'm going to be pitching to you guys? / like, as an independent, is there a possibility to do it myself and keep funding and be successful?
So in terms of the CV and the work samples for an indie that's coming to us with the pitch, I am most interested in being able to know what like type and complexity of work that you've done most recently and what you've done the most of, especially if it's something that I can like search for and listen to myself. Ideally, there would be a clip attached. I think that it's less important for me, speaking to like an indie creator, to know that they have worked on every show in public radio and like all this sort of podcasting, like every little detail. I just kind of want to know generally, and this is part of like selling yourself, like what are you best at, and what are you most passionate about, and what combination of that will be coming together to make this project you're pitching me a success. So in whatever ways that you can lay that out and demonstrate it with samples, that's the way to do it. Hopefully that's not too vague.
No, I think that's great. It's sort of narrowing down, like you do with a story in your pitch, what the essence is. You want to do that for yourself as well.
And then the second part is about if you're an indie and you want to keep fund it yourself and keep it, going on your own, right?
Yes.
So I don't have a ton of experience with this. I would encourage you all. I remember seeing Hillary Frank speak about this, I think it was 3 or 4 years ago at Third Coast, when she was talking about how she, found funding and brand relationships and that kind of thing for the longest, shortest time before it was picked up by WNYC when it was first picked up. And I remember that talk being kind of like, whoa, to me, because I also at that point I was still working at WNYC, so I didn't have like a for-profit background / didn't know how much anything cost ever or how to get money. And so I think that was a long time ago, but I do think that a lot of the things that she says in that talk and the Q&As that follow are really helpful, just in terms of, helping you think in those directions. So awesome. Strong recommendation.
Yeah, and you can find those on the Pocket Conference, I believe, from Third Coast. So all of the audio should be recorded.
And then in terms of finding, funding to keep making something on your own, there's sort of like the Patreon success stories that we've heard about. Like there's that Chapo Trap House podcast, which I've never heard, but they make like $80,000 a month on their Patreon. Wow. That, of course, was something that I don't know that much about the podcast, but I assume it's been on for years and years. They spent probably a lot of time just like not making any money building that audience. Like that's not something that they like fired up the podcast and suddenly they were pulling in 80 grand a month. All of it takes time. But I do think that, especially if you have a smaller audience, but it's a loyal audience, I think that, that's a way to bring in hundreds, if not like a couple $1,000s a month without ad revenue in order to keep your podcast loyal. Like, for example, I'm not proud of this, but one of my favorite podcasts to listen to that's like completely just outside of the world that I work in is a spin-off of a fan podcast for the program Vanderpump Rules. And it's hosted by, so it's like there's many layers of remove, but I just like the host. And she recently started a Patreon for her own podcast, and she has, I think, 250 people who are donating at some amount. So something that splintered can have, like, I think she's making, I don't know, but I would assume it's over probably $500 or something a month for her to do this podcast. And I think that, so much of it too, and this is like kind of something I'm a broken record about, it goes back to like understanding who your audience is, getting a sense of like what you can give them to still be like happy listeners. And I feel like if you're kind of in the practice of doing that already from like the initial idea creation stage, that being able to figure out how you can add value with like a Patreon or that sort of thing, that'll be some work that you've already done that you can pull out when the time comes.
Right. Yeah, it all helps. Awesome. So that comes to the end of our formal presentation, but we do have a few more questions and we have about 5 minutes left. So I would encourage folks to, if you do have follow-up questions, to type them into the box. I'm going to stop sharing my screen just to make sure I can see them all. And let's go to a question from the top of the hour, which was, just looking over my phone. I'm curious about your thoughts on ACAST.
Mm-hmm. So I forgot to mention that I had a note card that had international podcast networks that I dropped. So I enjoy ACAST. I know that they do a lot of work in Europe and internationally, and also in the US. I may be wrong here, but I don't think that they're doing a lot of a lot of original productions. Like I don't know if they're funding original productions within the US. So like if you were to go to them asking for production support, I'm not sure if they're doing that anymore, but they might be. But they will, acquire shows, you retain the IP, I believe, and then they sell ads against them. So I'm pro ACAST. Let the record state. I see Kate has disconnected. Is anyone else seeing that? Have I disconnected? It's just me now? Is anyone else? You guys can see me. Do you want to see my cat?
Okay.
My cat is right here.
Sorry, guys.
I was entertaining the audience.
Hello. What's the cat's name?
Lulu.
Oh, Lulu. That's the best.
Anyway, but yes, pro ACAST, catcast.
Nice. Okay, cool. So let's ask a couple more questions. Lori asks, what if you just want to pitch yourself as a worker bee freelance producer for someone else's podcast? Do you have to live in New York City, for example?
No. And I think increasingly what I've seen at least is we're working with people who aren't based here. And that's not like out of some specific sort of like means to not work with people in New York, but it's because like so many people are booked in New York, which is a great thing for the industry, but harder for people who are working at podcast networks trying to get things made. And so I don't think the location is necessarily important. I do think that your demonstrated ability and probably like track record in terms of being available is really important. Like I see when Mia Lobel is in this conference, and like I contacted her for the first season of Revisionist History just based on like sterling reputation, and which is still true, and also her ability. Like she just worked all over the place everywhere and always kind of delivered. And I was like, yes, music to my ears. And, that's all that I care about. And I would say that I think that that's also, just sort of the party line. Is there a party? Podcast line.
Great. Okay, final question. And it'll be Willow's. She's asking, if the network says yes to a show, who actually owns that content?
That is completely based on whatever the network's own business goals are. That is something that I would, if I were pitching to a network, I would and I wanted to retain IP, I would make that very clear from the beginning that is part of the whole deal. So it's I think that it's based on from network to network, but if you want to retain it, I think that you have to make that really clear from the beginning. Great.
So learning points, make everything clear from the beginning, flash out as much as you can, but also be flexible and know your worth. I think that's a really good point. Cool. Well, that does it. We're at the hour. So I want to say thank you again to Laura for being here and giving this really insightful talk. This will be recorded, so it'll be on the air daily, and then we'll also upload it to our YouTube and Facebook page, so you can find it at your leisure. But thank you again, and yeah, we'll see you at the next one. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
See
Bye.
you. Bye.